Welcome back to Face the Nation, and we continue our conversation now with former Trump economic advisor Gary Cohn. Gary, I want to pick up on where we just left off. In terms of stopping the bleeding that continues to be happening for some of these mid-sized banks like First Republic, is there a white knight? Does this only end when one of the big banks buys it up?
Margaret, most likely that will be the scenario. At the end of the day, the banks that are most qualified and have the most secure and soundest balance sheets that can afford to absorb some of these larger regional banks are the largest banks in America, which in an ironic way is the last thing that the regulatory community and Congress wants to see. But that probably will be the likely outcome.
There were reports that Warren Buffett, the legendary investor, has been talking to the Biden administration. Is that a way around that?
You know, it could be, but then Warren Buffett would become a bank holding company, and the restrictions on bank holding companies are fairly dramatic, and he would have to understand what that meant to his everyday core business, what he could do, what he couldn't do, and all the regulations and restrictions he would have upon himself after having become a bank holding company. It's not a simple decision.
Well, part of that decision has to also be, you know, is this going to hurt me in the long term? Larry Fink, who you know, he runs the world's largest asset manager, told investors a few days ago, we could see more seizures and shutdowns coming. He said you could see something like the saving and loans crisis in the 80s and the 90s, where thousands of lenders just disappeared. Is he overstating it?
No, I think Larry's not overstating it. This is a crisis of confidence right now, to some extent. Bank runs are a crisis of confidence. The government has put in place a backstop for the two banks that we know are in trouble. Mm-hmm. The banking industry itself is trying to help a third bank by putting deposits into that bank. So we know what the remedy is for three banks, but there are thousands of small and regional banks in the United States. This usually just doesn't stop after two. We're going to continue to go. And investors and depositors will evaluate each bank, and one by one, they will start saying, what is the next bank that is least secure that I most likely do not want to have my deposits in?
And you know trading world well, that moves like this. It moves so fast. It takes a lot longer for Congress to act or do anything.
Look, these bank runs, because of the way they've been digitized and the fact that everyone has online banking or telephone banking, these bank runs now can happen in minutes. You know, it's not like you're going to the bank anymore and you're standing in line at the front door and you can slow it down. You can't slow down digital banking.
So you have called in an op-ed for common sense regulation. You do want Congress to act, you say, with smaller bank oversight. You say the role of the board of directors should be evaluated because of what happened at SVB. Apparently, they didn't have a lot of experience on it. That the $250,000 limit on deposit insurance should be raised. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Warren hit the same numbers you did, $2, $5, and $10 million.
Yep.
Doesn't that trickle down to customers and just make their costs go up if that kind of insurance extension happens?
Well, you're right. Former chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton, and myself wrote an op-ed where we talked about, look, you have to have a board that has qualifications. They have to understand banking. How can a board oversee a bank that they don't have qualifications? And yes, expand deposit insurance, but you could have tiered pricing. It could be one pricing for deposits below $250,000, and then you could have tiered pricing. As your deposits go up and you want them insured, it will be more expensive to insure those deposits. But the key here is, Margaret, and this is very important, we need to keep deposits in the U.S. banking system. It's imperative that we keep deposits in the U.S. banking system because that's how we grow our economy, by allowing banks to re-lend those deposits into consumers to consume, to buy houses, to buy cars, to go to college.
Right.
There is an alternative. There's a very important alternative that we talked about in our op-ed. The alternative is U.S. Treasury bonds or U.S. Treasury bills. They pay a higher rate and they have a tax advantage to them. The horrible outcome would be if people take their money out of banks in the United States and put them into U.S. Treasury obligations. That would have a dramatic impact on slowing down economic growth and slowing down the economy.
The Federal Reserve meets this week. They control interest rates. Given the anxiety that's happening, can Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, go ahead with the hike he has planned, or are things so bad out there that he can't do what the market expects?
Look, he's in a tough spot. We still have inflation. We're starting to see some positive signs that inflation is coming down. Inflation hurts consumers as well. I think Jerome Powell is going to need to raise rates 25 basis points this week. And then I think in his statement, in his press conference, he's going to need to talk about how the Fed understands the cumulative effect, the lags effects of interest rates, and that they're going to be acutely aware of watching for the cumulative effects, the lags effects, and they're going to be very data dependent as they move forward. And I think he'll leave himself a lot of room in the forward meetings to do whatever they need to do, which may be pause, maybe cut, or it may be increased, depending on how inflation's going in the United States.
Because all of this will have an impact on the broader economy. Ultimately.
All of it. Both the banking side as well as what the Fed does in policy.
And we know there's political ramifications, too. That's why we pull all the threads together here, Gary. Thank you for your analysis. We'll be right back. And we're back now with the co-hosts of the Pivot podcast, Kara Swisher, who joins us from San Francisco, and Scott Galloway, who joins us this morning from Miami. And in the interest of full disclosure, we want to note that Galloway is a marketing professor at NYU, but also directly or indirectly involved with several firms who have had funds at SVB Bank. None are facing liquidity issues due to failure, he tells us. Scott, with that, I want to start with you here. What is the broader impact to America's ability to continue innovating in the wake of this failure?
Good to be with you, Margaret. Yeah, the modern U.S. banking system is a miracle. It takes short-term deposits and it turns them into long-term loans such we can grow the economy. The issue is, do we have what Marjorie Taylor Greene asked for, and that is the U.S. splitting in two? And it's not between red and blue states, it's between what I would call venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who are trying to construct a solution, and venture catastrophists who appear to have a vested interest in a weakening of the banking system in the U.S. dollar. There was a letter that went out trying to facilitate a transaction signed by several hundred VCs. What is more interesting is who is not on that list. And it's people with a large interest in crypto who have seen crypto go up 20% since there was huge insecurity injected into the system by, again, this kind of constant catastrophizing. So do we have two Americas in Silicon Valley? And I think lawmakers and Americans are trying to ask, should we be backstopping Americans or agents of chaos?
Who are you thinking of? Who are these agents of chaos?
Well, people who pose for the social media algorithms and in all caps say that chaos will ensue, that there will be lines around the banks. Some will get their money out, most will not. Large venture capital firms who have tens of billions invested in crypto, so do not share kind of a collective interest in the health of the banking system. And individuals who on the way up see America as a cross between the Hunger Games and capitalism, on the way down believe we should be Denmark. So capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down is neither, it's cronyism.
Kara, so many startup firms relied on this Silicon Valley lender to get their business going, and they can't necessarily go to bigger banks. Is there a knock-on effect here where we see this huge part of our economy crippled?
Well, no, there's money for them. There's always money for them. They used to say there's not enough rat holes to shove all the money in Silicon Valley down. So I think they'll get money. It's just that this bank was particularly attuned to them, including giving them personal mortgages, personal loans, using collateral that was, just the stock or the fact that the venture capitalists invested in them. And so they had a harder time with traditional banks, and this bank catered to them in that way. And it was sort of a creature of Silicon Valley, and they had advisors from Silicon Valley, and every Silicon Valley startup was in this bank in some fashion. And then they spread it around to events and other things. And so it's a bank that's too niche to one group of people. And then it's also a group of people that reacts really quickly, which is why the bank run happened when they realized they couldn't sell these treasury bonds.
I want to ask you about what is about to happen here in Washington with this hearing this week. TikTok's CEO is going to be called in to testify. Kara, CBS has confirmed reports that the Justice Department is investigating that company for spying on U.S. citizens, including American journalists, by looking for their location data. And reportedly, some of the people doing this were based in China. The parent company says they're no longer employed. Does this kind of surveillance happen at other social media firms?
Well, in a different way. They're selling you advertising, of course, because we have no privacy bill, national privacy bill in this country. And so it's, whatever these companies want to do, they have a lot of power to do so. I call them information thieves, but that's for a different reason. That's to sell you advertising. In this case, it feels a little more frightening in that it's a state-run government. Now TikTok has said these are rogue actors, but the fact that they can do it means they can do it, meaning if China wants to do it, they can do it. And so that's the big worry here, is not only surveillance, but propaganda. And so when Facebook's dishing it out, or Meta or whatever, they're doing it for business reasons. Not great either. And by the way, a government could come in there, and any government could come in there. And so we have to really be very careful about what all of these companies get, but particularly worried about state actors.
It seems that news development really throws some sand in the gears of progress on what ByteDance and TikTok were proposing as a way around the issue, which was something they called Project Texas. They don't want a ban. They don't want to be forced to be sold. How, Scott, does this end up getting resolved?
Well, America's waking up to the fact that there's a neural jack plugged into the heads of America's youth who spend more time on TikTok than every other streaming media platform. And we're understandably wary of the CCP, who would be stupid not to put their thumb on the scale of anti-American content and raise the next generation of American civic, nonprofit, business, and military leaders that just every day feel incrementally worse about America. How it gets solved is very straightforward. The CCP was hoping that we wouldn't be able to get out of our own way, and there's a lot of evidence they might have been right, but they would like to maintain the world's premier propaganda tool and hundreds of billions of dollars in shareholder value. And on the eve of the ban, they will decide if they can't hold on to both, they'll hold on to the hundreds of billions of dollars, and they will agree to a spin.
Kara, what do you see here? I mean, it was amazing. The Washington Post had huge ads TikTok placed here in the local papers. And, the Commerce Secretary was asked about a possible ban. And Gina Raimondo said, quote, "The politician in me thinks you're literally going to lose every voter under 35 forever." That is the political element here. How does this play out if it's on the devices of 200 million Americans?
Well, there is that. There's that issue of people using it, and it's very popular. I think there's been some advances made by other services now, so it's a little less of a grip on teenagers. But I don't think there's going to be some giant protests by teens. I think the issue you have to think about is what happens if they ban, what happens to the money, because there's a lot of U.S. investors in this company, let's be clear. And then there's a lot of U.S. investors very interested in the decline of TikTok, so that's going on behind the scenes at the same time. But it's very popular for politicians to use this as an anti-China, which they do. And it's bipartisan, by the way.
Right.
It's also Mark Warner, even as it's Josh Hawley. And so, 4 years ago, I wrote a piece saying, I love TikTok, great product. I'm using it on a burner phone because I don't trust the Communist Party. And so that's the issue. This is a tool of propaganda, and the question is, what do we do about it? And why aren't U.S. companies allowed in China? And so it's very complex. I'm not sure. I'm not way down with the ban with Scott, who's been calling for a while. I do think there are ways to protect people, but it's very difficult if it's not a utterly U.S.-owned company or somewhere else, and that's going to be difficult for this company.
I just want to
now at this juncture, given.
I just want to underscore what you said, which is, for years you have said you don't feel safe using this device, this on a device that you carry with you. You use a phone that you don't take anywhere with you because of the risk level here. I mean, this is in the pockets of millions of Americans, hundreds of millions.
Yeah. I don't use Facebook either, so that's me. I don't trust any of them, but I really don't trust the Communist Party of China more than, I guess, Mark Zuckerberg. So low bar.
Just wow. Quickly, Scott, we are looking at the potential indictment of the 45th president of the United States, who is back on social media platforms. Have there been any measures put in place that would limit the ability to use this as an organizing tool or in a dangerous way as he calls for protests?
Not that I know of. I find it kind of borderline comical, this kind of hollow debate around First Amendment or speech or pretending these organizations pretending it was a really difficult decision. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, an organization or an individual adds shareholder value to these companies one of two ways. They create a lot of engagement through enragement or awe, or they spend a lot of money on the platform. And about the time that President Trump was about to become much less enraging or have much less content, about a few days before Biden's inauguration, Meta found their backbone and kicked him off. And about the time he's about to spend another billion or $1.5 billion on media, they've all of a sudden decided he should come back on the platform. But my understanding is the President Trump has called for protests. And the last time he called for protests, we had an insurrection. Yeah. So if they've ever wanted an excuse not to put him back on the platforms, but they have it. But at the end of the day, this is all about what drives shareholder value, not any sense of what connects us or any fidelity to the Commonwealth.
Well, on that cynical note, we will leave it there. Scott, Kara, always good to talk to you. We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to former National Security Advisor, retired General H.R. McMaster, who joins us from Palo Alto, California. I want to talk about Russia and China with you, but first, stability in this country. The former president who you worked for has issued this call for protests. How concerned are you about security and what it means for the country?
Well, of course, Margaret, what I'm hoping for is that Americans come to their senses and recognize that we have strong institutions and should have confidence in the due process of law. And I think that's what you're seeing play out here. Nobody's above the law. And I hope Americans really recognize that what's not appropriate at this stage is any kind of violence, but really to demand the best from our institutions, to ensure that they're insulated from any kind of political interference, but to have confidence, that if the president is, as rumored to be indicted, that he will have the opportunity to defend, himself against these charges. Mm-hmm.
And we will be following that. When it comes to your wheelhouse on the national security front, we just saw these images of Vladimir Putin defiantly traveling to Ukraine. His first known trip to the occupied Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin made a point to say he visited children's centers. This is days after an arrest warrant was issued on charges of abducting and deporting Ukrainian children forcibly to Russia. How do you interpret this?
Well, I think this is a moment of clarity. I mean, look at just the brazen cynicism associated with him going to Sebastopol, which he illegally annexed in 2014, and then to Mariupol, going there at night, visiting sites, the few sites, that hadn't been rubbled, by the Russian military as they inflicted murder on the innocent people in Mariupol. And as you mentioned, he's just been indicted by the International Criminal Court for kidnapping tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. And of course, this is all on the eve of Xi Jinping, visiting Putin. So I think what you're seeing is really quite clearly this axis of authoritarians who are a real threat to freedom and to civilized people around the world.
China, we should also know, is accused by the U.S. government of actively conducting genocide against minorities in country. Absolutely. Do you think it gives any pause to Xi Jinping when he boards that flight to Moscow that Vladimir Putin just had this arrest warrant issued?
Sadly, Margaret, I don't think so. Remember, it's really 10 years ago, almost to the day, that Xi Jinping made his first visit to Moscow, and they declared their special friendship. Since then, they've just continued to double down on this relationship. Remember, just before the Beijing Olympics last year, just prior to the reinvasion of Ukraine on February 24th, they professed their partnership with no limits. And he's visiting Moscow at a time when it's become clear from U.S. government reports and from investigative journalists that China is supplying weapons, munitions, all kinds of other support for Putin as he continues this onslaught against the Ukrainian people. This, of course, is economic support. China has increased their purchase of Russian oil by 60%, and they're buying more natural gas. They're providing all sorts of technological capabilities that are important to sustaining Russia's war-making machine.
The U.S. government admits they know surveillance footage or things used for enhancing targeting in the battlefield is being sold by Chinese companies, but they say no lethal support yet has happened. You're saying you don't believe that?
I don't believe that. I think what you're going to see in the coming days and weeks is more and more evidence of Chinese support. China doesn't want to get caught doing this, right? Because at the same time as they're helping the Russians murder Ukrainians, they're also saying, hey, China's open for business. And they're trying to appeal to American and other investors to continue to prop up their statist mercantilist model, even as they commit genocide, even as Xi Jinping, just in the recent People's Congress last week, he gave really 4 speeches, essentially preparing the Chinese people for war. I mean, these were jingoistic speeches. He also made it clear that the security economy is going to dominate, over the free market economy or the tech sector. And so I think it's time for us really to assess the degree to which we have been over many years underwriting in many ways our own demise, with investments in China and really not doing more to shore up fragile supply chains. We've essentially given an authoritarian regime coercive power over our economy.
I want to ask
much
you,
like Europe did with Russia on hydrocarbons.
I want to ask you about Republican Governor Chris Sununu wrote an op-ed saying some in the Republican Party have lost their moral compass on foreign policy, evidenced by former President Trump, who once called Putin's invasion genius and savvy. The governor of Florida has said similar things that appear to be diminishing the importance of the conflict. What do you make of the fact that top 2 contenders for president in the Republican Party are pushing this?
Well, I think it's sad, Margaret. I think, why not just focus on 2 things? Look at how valorous the Ukrainians have been fighting for their own freedom. That should restore confidence, maybe, in our own nation and the gift that we have of being free and having freedom of expression and freedom from fear. I think also look at just the atrocities that have been visited on the Ukrainian people. And then also recognize that it's in our interest. Where does it stop? Putin went to Sebastopol, which he had annexed in 2014.
Sure.
And of course, there's a direct line between that and the reinvasion. So I think if we're not strong,
I've got to leave it here,
Thanks,
but I
Margaret.
appreciate your analysis. We'll be right back.